Hi kids, this is a really important video. It's about free body diagrams in Netforce. It's something we'll be using throughout the rest of the year, so hopefully you're really paying attention and definitely have your notebook out. You'll want to be writing down some of this stuff as we go along today. So we've been talking quite a bit about objects' momentum and changing it, and we've come up with this conclusion about what changes an object's overall momentum. Anytime we have external forces acting on an object, the momentum will change. Of course, the time matters too, but in general, we have to have an external force acting on an object, which will cause its momentum to change. So for example, if we have an apple that's falling from a tree, there's actually two external forces acting on the apple. The first is the force of gravity down, and the second is actually some air resistance acting upwards. But overall, you'll notice the gravity is stronger, which is pulling down, so the object gains momentum down. Second example, when that falling object hits the ground. We still have the force of gravity down on that object, but now we have a different force acting upwards. It's the normal force that's acting from the ground pushing upwards. And in this case, the normal force is actually stronger, which causes that apple's momentum to have a upwards or positive change in momentum, which is what actually brings it to a stop. Another example we haven't really talked about, a book sliding to a stop on a desk. After you let go of the book, if you think about the forces that are acting on it, well, there's actually three forces. There's gravity pulling downwards, there's the normal force from the table pushing upwards on it, and then there's a sideways force of friction that's in the opposite direction from the whichever direction it's moving, and that's the force that's actually causing it to slow down. So it's an external force of friction that's causing it to slow down. So if all these external forces can cause a change in the object's momentum, what about objects whose momentum isn't changing? What can be said about the forces or acting on those objects? Can there still be forces acting on an object if its momentum is standing still? How about external forces? If you think about some objects like the apple just sitting on the ground, hopefully you'll realize there are still forces acting on that object. Gravity's still acting on that object. It's still on Earth. And even those forces might even be external, right? If we're not including the entire Earth in the apple system, the apple has external forces acting on it. However, if those external forces are balanced by other external forces that are exactly the same size, then the object's momentum won't change. So we would say an object's momentum does not change if all the forces acting on that object are either internal or all the external forces are balanced out. So just what I mentioned a minute ago, apple sitting on the ground, the gravity would be trying to change that object's momentum, trying to change that apple's momentum, trying to speed it up downwards. However, it's balanced out by an opposite change upwards caused by the normal force. Or an example of your car in cruise control on the highway means your car is going at a constant speed, so the momentum of that car is actually not changing. In that case, the car's tires are pushing the car forward. That would normally cause a change in momentum because that's an external force. However, friction acting on the car would normally cause the opposite change in momentum. So overall, that object's momentum doesn't change. An easier way to think about this is by using an idea called the net force. The net force is the total unbalanced portion of all the forces acting on an object. It's a way to basically cancel out the changes in momentum acting on an object by external forces before you have to do all those ugly momentum calculations. So for example, if you have two dogs pulling on a bone, and one is pulling with a force of 20 newtons, and the other is pulling with a force of negative 20 newtons, okay, you can assume that that object's momentum is not going to change because the net force, which is the total unbalanced portion of the force, is zero. Those two forces cancel each other out. So the net force of an object is always zero when the external forces are balanced. In this case, that means that the object's momentum will not be changing. If you ever have a net force of zero, your object will be moving with a constant velocity without having a change in momentum. Another example of a net force, this time that does not equal 0, if you had the dog and a lion pulling on a bone. The dog is pulling with a force of 20 newtons. The lion's pulling with a force of negative 200 newtons. In this case, the net force, or the total, is negative 180 newtons. So the net force is a little bit less than the lion pulling by itself. That means the momentum change of this bone is not going to speed up quite as much as if it would if the lion was the only object pulling on it, because the dog's pulling in the opposite direction. So instead of calculating momentum change from each of those external forces, the dog and the lion separately, first we figure out what's the total force acting on the object, and then we can use that total force to calculate momentum instead of doing a whole bunch of different momentum calculations. As a note, the net force on an object is not 0 when the forces are unbalanced, right? So if we have one force pulling harder than the others, we're going to have a non-zero F net, and that means, by definition, the object's momentum will be changing. It'll be speeding up or slowing down. One important tool that we use to help us picture what's going on with the net force on an object is called a free body diagram. Sometimes that's abbreviated FBD. And a free body diagram is a picture of an object and all the forces acting on it. It's important that the only thing you put in a free body diagram is forces. You don't put velocities or masses or anything else in the free body diagram, just the forces. So the point of a free body diagram is it allows us to see whether the forces are balanced or unbalanced. It allows us to see very quickly if there's going to be a net force on an object, so we can tell if an object's momentum is going to be changing. One thing it can't do is tell you specifically about whether the object's moving forward or backward or stopped, or whether it's speeding up or slowing down. And that's because if we don't put our velocity on the object, we can't tell what's happening with the object. And a change in momentum by itself does not tell you whether the object's speeding up or slowing down. Remember, an object can have a positive change in momentum and be slowing down if the object was moving in the negative direction to begin with. So you need to have additional information about the object besides what's on the free body diagram. Specifically, usually it's the current velocity or the initial velocity of the object. And once you have that, then you can start figuring out whether the object, what direction it's moving, and whether it's speeding up or slowing down or keeping a constant speed. Okay, so let's go through a free body diagram for an object we've seen before, that piano that was being pushed in the last video that you watched. The difference you'll notice, first difference, is that we're going to make an open system that just includes the piano. So we're going to get rid of all those other objects, which means we don't care about the forces acting on them. Now, those forces still exist. If we wanted to, learn about how the momentum of those other objects were changing, we'd have to think about those forces. But in this case, we're only going to be dealing with the forces that are acting on the piano, because that's the only object that we have inside of our system. So we still have those 4 forces acting on that piano. First thing we're going to do is draw our piano. Check that out. I'm a pretty good drawer of pianos. In general, I know a lot of you guys are still enjoying drawing objects, but it takes a lot of time and it sort of makes things look messy. So on free body diagrams, we really prefer that they're just a box or a dot, no matter what the objects are. So there's my piano, and I want to add the forces that are acting on the piano. So I'd put in my gravitational force. It's acting on the piano. You should label the type of force if you know what it is. So it's gravity, so F with a little g underneath it. And you should always put the name of the object that is causing that force. In this case, gravity is caused by the Earth. If we had no Earth, we'd have no gravity. So I'm going to put Fg from Earth. You'll note that I also have an arrow. Okay, the arrow is going to point in the direction the force is going to act. Gravity is pulling downwards on the piano, so it's going to be pointing downwards. And the size of these arrows, just like we did with velocity, is going to tell us something about the size of the forces. As we put more forces on here, we're going to think about how their size compares to gravity. Second force I'm going to put on is going to be my normal force on the piano from the ground. So it's a normal force because it's 2 objects that are in contact with each other. The second object is the ground, so the object that's pushing upwards on the piano is the ground, so I'm going to label it Fn ground so that I know what is the type of force and what is the object causing it. That force is acting upwards, right? The ground is holding the piano up, so it should be an arrow pointing up, and it should actually be the same length as the gravitational force from Earth. If it, what that tells me actually is that we're balanced forces up and down. That means that my object will not be gaining any momentum either upwards or downwards. My piano is going to not rise up off the floor or plummet down through the floor because those forces are balanced up and down. Then I'll include my next two forces. So we've got a normal force from the pusher. It's a person's hands are pushing on the piano, so it's a normal force. And the person obviously is the pusher. That force is to the right, so I'm going to put that arrow pointing to the right. I made it a little bit smaller than the force of gravity from the piano because I don't actually think the person's going to be able to push as hard as gravity is pulling downwards on that piano, but that's kind of subjective. The last force is the friction from the floor. So FF for a force of friction, and the surface of the floor is what's causing friction. If we didn't have any floor surface, it wouldn't be, we wouldn't have any friction. The direction of that force is going to be to the left. Friction always acts opposite from the direction that the object is moving. And in this case, I made friction smaller than the pusher. I'm assuming that this person pushing is actually speeding up the piano, although that may not be the case in every scenario. Let's try another 3 or 4 of these things because they actually take some work to get good at. Free body diagram of a falling apple. Okay, nice picture of an apple right there. First force I'm going to put in, again, is force of gravity. That's usually the first one you want to put in because every object on Earth will have it. If you happen to be not on Earth, you'd have to think about that. But I'll put in my force of gravity from Earth. Then I'm going to put in some air resistance acting upwards, slowing down that apple. The type of force, you can call it AR or right air resistance, and the object is the air. So that's what a free body diagram looks like of a falling apple. You'll notice that this free body diagram is unbalanced. Okay, the air is smaller than, the force upward from air is smaller than the force downwards from Earth, so this object's momentum will be changing. The next one is going to be a free body diagram of the apple as it's landing. Okay, now that apple is still on Earth. That means we still have gravity acting on the apple. Nothing's changed about that gravity. It's the same size as it was in the last free body diagram because it's the same apple. Earth is pulling down on it with the same amount of force. So we have the same Fg downwards. We do have another force though, and this time it's a normal force upwards from the ground. It's going to be a large upwards force, and we know that because the object is actually going to have an upwards change in momentum. It was moving downwards and it's going to come to a stop, so we need a delta P that is upwards. That means the ground has to be pushing up harder on the apple than gravity's pulling down on the apple. For a short moment in time while that apple is coming to a stop, that ground has to be pushing upwards a little bit extra hard on it. So this is what the free body diagram would look like. Another free body diagram of a book that's sliding on a desk coming to a stop. As always, we're going to start off with gravity. It's on Earth. I put in the normal force from the ground or the table. Those things should be equal because that book is not crashing down through the table or shooting up through up into the air off the table. And then I'm going to put in the force of friction caused, I guess I have my book on the floor, caused by the floor as the book is sliding. And so this book is sliding to the right. We have friction acting out to the left. Turns out those are the only 3 forces. If the person isn't still pushing the book, if it's just sliding to a stop, there's no pushing force. There's no normal force from a person. So think about your system. If the person's not touching that object, then the force isn't going to be on there. So this object is unbalanced. Free body diagram shows that the momentum of the object's changing. We know that's happening. That book is actually slowing down. So we should have an unbalanced free body diagram. Let's look at a couple of free body diagrams that would be balanced. Anytime we have an object that has constant momentum, the velocity is not changing, we'll have a balanced free body diagram. So that apple sitting on the ground after it came to a stop, so after its speed was changed until it hit 0, then we have the force of gravity still acting on it. We're still on Earth, downwards. And now that normal force has actually changed. It's still upwards, but it's not pushing upwards as hard. It doesn't have to be pushing upwards as hard because the apple isn't having to be brought to a stop anymore. It's already stopped. Normal force kind of adjusts itself based on what it needs to do to maintain the integrity of the surface of the floor, of the ground. Another balanced free body diagram that people tend to have a hard time with, free body diagram of a car using cruise control. Okay, so we start off with gravity and the normal force from the ground. Those should be balanced because the car isn't crashing down through the ground or going up. But we also know that the sideways forces should be balanced too, because this object isn't speeding up or slowing down sideways either. which means that if we have a forward force, pushing force from the engine, it has to be exactly balanced out by the friction force from the road surface. So this car is moving. It has friction. We wouldn't have friction if we weren't moving, and the car is being pushed. Even though the free body diagram is balanced, it's moving. It's just moving with a constant momentum. It's got a velocity that's not changing. Free body diagram of your desk right now. Start off with gravity pushing downwards on the desk, okay? It's being attracted by the Earth's gravity downwards. But there's actually something else pushing downwards on it right now. Probably a few things, but I'm just going to put in one, and that's a notebook or your computer, depending on what you're looking at. So because that computer is sitting on top of the desk, it's actually got a normal force pushing downwards on the desk. So there's actually two downward forces. Now we know that that desk isn't changing momentum. It's standing still. It's not speeding up or slowing down. That means that all those forces are going to have to be balanced out. So what is the upward force? Well, again, it's that normal force from the ground holding your desk up. And you'll notice that that upward normal force is bigger than gravity and bigger than the notebook. It's equal to the two of them added together. It has to be, because we have to have balanced forces if our object is going to continue moving at a constant momentum. I didn't give you guys numbers in any of those free body diagrams. In general, I care a lot more about you labeling the arrows, the size of the arrows, the type of force, and the object that's causing those forces. But occasionally we'll be using numbers as well. So for example, if I had an object with two upward, an upward and downward force, it had 50 newtons up and negative 4 newtons down. This could be like my apple landing on the ground, for example. You could come up with a number for the net force on this object. In this case, it's going to be positive 46 newtons. That's how much extra force is left over when that negative 4 is canceled away from the 50. This could be that apple sitting on the ground, or something bigger than an apple, I guess, because we have more force. But if we have an object that is just a 50 Newton object sitting on the ground, the upward force cancels out the downward force completely. The net force on that object will be equal to 0. This is that same object, but this time it's not sitting on the ground. We don't have a normal force pushing up on it, so it must be falling. Although I guess I don't have an upward force of air resistance, so it's falling somewhere where there's no air. Maybe this thing is on the moon. There's still gravity pulling downwards on it, but there's no air pushing upwards on it. At any rate, the net force on that object will be negative 50. It's the only force acting on the object, so the total unbalanced portion is negative 50. This object here is a little bit more complicated because we have to consider up, down, and left, right forces. The up, down forces are 0. So the net force in the up and down direction would be 0, but there is a negative 1 Newton unbalanced net force to the left. Or we can look at an object where we're balanced in all directions. So up and down is balanced, side and side is balanced. This object overall has a net force of 0 because all the forces are balanced out with each other. Quick little summary. The net force is the total unbalanced force acting on an object. And if you have a net force that's 0, that means an object is constant velocity. If your net force is not 0, the object's changing velocity or changing momentum. We use free body diagrams as tools to help us see when there's a balanced or unbalanced net force. You can also create a free body diagram based on what you know about the object's motion. So if you know that we are having a positive change in momentum, you know that you have to have unbalanced forces to the right or up in your free body diagram. And then just a reminder that we can use that net force that sometimes we can calculate from our free body diagram in our FATMAV equation. The net force times the change in time is going to be equal to the mass times the change in velocity. All right, hopefully you guys got some good notes on this. You may need to go back and watch this one again once or twice. It's pretty important information. Thank you.